that the definition of an Englishman is somebody who thinks that 100 miles is a long way, and the definition of an American is somebody who thinks 100 years is a long time.
You are now listening to the IELTS podcast. Learn from tutors, your host, Ben Worthington.
On this episode, we have Andrew Watt. He's an English teacher in the US, and I was watching a few videos and I thought he'd be really helpful for some of the IELTS students for the stuff that he says and the stuff that he said on his videos. He's also got a blog, and in there he puts his poetry, he gives tips, and his YouTube channel is full of tips as well for good writing. And that you can just find him on YouTube under Andrew Watt. And in this episode, he's going to tell us about paragraphs, how to write good paragraphs, and how to clean up our sentences. So, also, just one small thing for me, if you have a few minutes spare, I'd really appreciate it if you could go over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. That would be awesome. Have a listen to this episode and send me an email if you enjoyed it and tell me what you thought about it. I know that some students have challenges with paragraphs. Could you explain the concept and the rules we have to consider when we are writing the paragraphs? I saw some videos and you said focus on the main idea, focus on specificity, and those qualities.
Sure. What kinds of things do your students write on their exams?
Right then. Well, there's typical questions, and it might be something like, let's see, pollution is inevitable due to the industrialization of the countries, of developing countries. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of industrialization and pollution, and then it'll be something like 250 words. Yeah, so it's like modern factors that are and things and activities that are going on in society, stuff you'll see in the newspaper, topics you'll see in the newspaper.
So the way to approach a paragraph is to decide what the overall subject of the paper is going to be. Mm-hmm. So let's say that it's the pollution example. Mm-hmm. As an English writer, I would say, okay, what are 3 sources of pollution that I know? Well, there are cars, automobiles, mm-hmm. and trucks on the road. That's one source of pollution. Another source of pollution would be waste from factories. That would be a second one. Mm-hmm. And a third would be accidents, like a spill of oil from a tanker running aground somewhere.
Yeah.
So there are my 3 examples. Transportation waste, factory waste, and accidents. Those are the effects of industrialization. Each of those is going to be a paragraph. Right. So that I'm learning to separate by big ideas first. Pollution is the overall subject. Here are 3 examples of pollution. I've got 3 paragraphs. Let's pick one of those 3 paragraphs and break it down further. Let's pick cars, transportation. Let's look at the first paragraph.
Right.
My first sentence is going to start with very general words like transportation and maybe vehicles and highways. It's going to have words about very general, specific, or very general categories of things that cause pollution in the realm of transportation.
Yeah. My
last sentence in that paragraph might be my family car. So that a paragraph would start with the most general example and would end with the most specific and local example.
Right. That's how
maybe
you would structure the paragraph. First, introduce the big general idea about pollution and transport, and then slowly boil it down to something very specific and giving an example, a personal example in this case, of the family transport and your family vehicle.
right. So
Hmm.
you would start with if you were writing about Spain, you might start with the big highways in Spain, and then you would talk about, I don't even know if Valencia has a ring road or not.
Yeah.
A way that goes to the outside edge of the city.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you might break it down to specific vehicles on the street. Um, Here in the United States, about 1974 or 1975, we started requiring cars to burn only fuel without lead in it.
Yeah.
And it turns out that we were poisoning children before 1975 because the lead would become vaporized in the gas fumes from burning leaded gasoline. And it was getting into children's lungs and it was poisoning them.
Yeah.
Here's a very specific example of pollution, and it has a lot of very specific data attached to it. It has a year, 1975. It has an element from the periodic table, lead. It has a specific kind of lead, namely lead vapor. It has gasoline vapor.
Hmm.
All of those are very specific concepts and a specific kind of pollution. It's quite another thing earlier in the paragraph to talk about highways and cars and carbon monoxide. But at the end of the sentence, we should be down to measurements and specific sources of pollution and my family's car. So very general at the beginning of a paragraph and very specific at the end.
Right. I see. I see.
There's a reason for that. Most people, when they read, their eyes re-engage with a paragraph at the beginning of a new paragraph. But their brains sort of glaze over the last few words of the last paragraph.
I see.
They get tired, their eyes get tired, but at the introduction of each new idea, I'm reading a paper about pollution. Oh, I see that transportation is the first big issue. Oh, I see that factory waste is the second big issue. Oh, I see that pollution is the third, or accidental pollution is the third big issue.
Uh-huh.
Our brains won't necessarily retain all of the information in the paragraph, but we do pick up on the big ideas about what we've read. So by thinking about the overall structure of your 250 words, you start with the big ideas at the start of each paragraph, and you bury your details later in the paragraph.
I see. Right then. And when we're giving examples, we would this is when we would put the details in, the numbers, the dates, the places, and almost like evidence. As the more detailed it is, the more believable, the more credible.
When I teach debate club, we teach kids to make an assertion first. And we want them to assert something. There I am changing assertion to a verb.
Mm-hmm.
A student must assert first.
Yeah.
Is the claim being made? That's the first sentence in a paragraph. The next few sentences are reasons why the assertion is true. And then the last sentences of the paragraph are the evidence that the reasons are true.
Yes.
It's kind of like you're building a house, but you're building it from the roof down.
Yeah.
Right? The assertion is the big slope of the roof on the top of the house. The reasons are the walls of the first and the second and the ground floor.
Yeah.
And evidence is the foundation. It's the actual concrete blocks in the ground that prove what's being built on top of it.
Yes, I see.
And this means that your students, as long as they're not having to write these on the fly, that is, in the spur of the moment, that they can plan their essays ahead of time if they know the topic.
Uh-huh.
Right?
It depends. Sometimes they know, well, they know the topic areas, which are basically quite broad, but the general rule is they make a plan before they even start. They see the exam question and they have maybe 40 minutes, and then they write a plan, and then they actually produce the essay. Uh-huh.
So then it becomes a case of knowing some evidence, and you can know the evidence in Spanish or in English as long as you can translate between the two, right? But you have the evidence ahead of time, and ideally you learn a large body of evidence ahead of time.
Exactly.
And then you build your essay the way that we normally build houses. Foundation, then ground floor, then first floor, then second, then roof. Right?
Yeah.
So this is the hardest thing to get across to students sometimes, is that we want them to start off writing with the big idea and work their way down to the details. But the best way to plan your essay is to start with what details you know, and then choose your assertion and your reasons based on what evidence you're able to put forward. Right? So we as teachers ask them to write from the roof down to the foundations, but the students have to be thinking about the work from foundations up to roof.
So they see a question, they should try and think what solid evidence they have related to that, and then build up from there and take a stance depending on what evidence they have related to it.
Right.
I get you. That's a
Which
good
is
approach.
very awkward. Trying to convince students that this is the way that they should work is very hard. And of course it doesn't help because they see governments and politicians frequently, and corporations, decide that they want to do something and then create the evidence to back that position up. They start with the assertion, we should build a factory or we should build a new highway, and then they create the evidence that supports that particular idea, which is not the way that we ask them to learn how to write, of course.
No. Awesome. All right, that was good. That was good. I like that advice. I think I'll definitely incorporate that into my teaching. Okay. And another thing you said for improving the cleanness of a sentence was to cut the repeated words and to make it more concentrated.
So let's say that we'll take the Guardia Civil example from probably 1963 or 64, when my grandfather was painting, my uncle was painting in Spain, right? We could say the Guardia Civil inspected my uncle's paintings and inspected his papers. We've used the word inspected twice.
Yeah.
But it's better to say the Guardia Civil inspected his paintings and his papers.
Yeah, I see.
Right? So we're using one verb rather than two. The other way to phrase that would be, another awkward way of phrasing that would be, the Guardia Civil inspected my uncle's paintings and subjected his papers to an inspection. We've used the word inspected as a verb, and we've used inspection as a noun. But again, the simplification is the Guardia Civil inspected my uncle's paintings and his papers. So Squeezing down to shorter sentences sometimes makes your writing look simple, like you don't know a whole lot of words.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, it's a very sophisticated thing. Poor
Yes.
English speakers need to use a lot of words to say very simple things, whereas people who speak any language natively, whether it be Spanish or English, are capable of squeezing a lot of meaning into a very small number of words.
Exactly, yeah. It's just more powerful and
It's
more
much more
succinct.
powerful because they know a lot more vocabulary, they have a lot more words at their disposal,
Mm.
and they can shift back and forth between tenses. They know how to describe past, present, and future,
Yeah.
and they know how to shift words from being nouns to being verbs, and vice versa.
So they can, yeah, so it's all just a lot more controlled, yeah, and carries more punch for each word.
Right. At any time you can take 3 or 4 words and replace them with one, you should.
We did this with some advanced students. For example, instead of saying the local government do not have money, you could just say the local government or even the council lack finance. How can a student like clean a sentence? I was in your videos. There was something that you spoke about cleaning a sentence, cutting
Oh,
repeated words and things like that. Could you just explain a bit about that, please?
sure. Students in the United States have a tendency to create run-on sentences.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by a run-on sentence is usually a sentence that contains 3 or more complete sentences inside of it that aren't joined together by any conjunctions. They'll be joined together by commas, perhaps, but no
Mm-hmm.
real punctuation.
Right.
So it's a good idea for students to pick a number under 20 and try to write sentences that contain that many words or fewer.
See.
So let me see if I can give an example of this. I happen to have a student paper in front of me. Let me grab one here and see what I can find.
Okay.
It says, the rich plantation owners had more influence than the yeomen, comma, so slavery was more influential in southern states. It's not really a very good sentence, but let's work with it.
Mm-hmm.
The rich plantation owners had more influence than the yeomen. Let's start with the first clause.
Right.
There's the word the in English is very complicated because it's one of those words that can be used or doesn't have to be used. But it's not a good way to begin a sentence. So in this case, I'd advise this student to clean up the sentence by dropping the word the and starting with rich. So I'd say rich plantation owners, and that becomes the subject of my sentence.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Had more influence than yeoman is the predicate of the sentence. And I would want him to try to replace had more with a stronger verb choice.
Yeah.
Because had more is 2 words, and what I want him to do is try to find a verb that gets across the idea of had more influence. And as it so happens, I can use the word influence as a verb, right?
So we transform the noun to a verb to move the sentence along.
The verb, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, rich planters or rich plantation owners influenced. Now I have the option of giving a good direct object, right? I can put in a direct object. In my Latin class, I would call it an accusative case noun, where I'd say rich plantation owners influenced state governments, more than yeoman. And the yeoman is, in this case, is a term from American history. They are Southern landowners who do not own slaves.
Right.
Sort of a weird case of a word, but
Mm-hmm.
so the rich plantation owners becomes just rich plantation owners rather than the rich plantation owners. Influenced. So I'm getting ahead of myself. My sentence, by eliminating the and changing had more to just influenced, my sentence is now rich plantation owners influenced than yeomans, which is not very good, and I need a direct object now.
I see.
Rich plantation owners influenced state governments more than yeomen.
Right.
So their ideas about slavery influenced government more. Maybe that's where I want to try to go with this.
Mm-hmm.
So the cleaning process is frequently taking weak verbs like is and had and transposing nouns from being nouns into being verbs and using them as verbs in order to strengthen and focus the ideas that you're trying to get across to your reader.
Yes. And it moves the
that
sentence. Go on, sorry.
Is that helpful?
Yes, yes. I was going to say, if you've got verbs in there describing things, it's like you said, instead of had more influence, you say influenced. You say the same thing or a similar thing with one word instead of three, and it moves the sentence along.
Right. And it also gives power to the subject of the sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In the case of had more influence, the assumption is that influence is a physical thing that you can hold on to. But
Yeah.
influence is not. It's a very abstract noun. So by making it influence as a verb, you, the writer, are giving power to the subject of your sentence because you're saying that it has the power to make change.
And remember to leave your email for updates and early access to new podcasts.